The bucket was heavier than it looked. Georgina Moonfire had carried many heavy things in her life: grief, silence, the particular weight of being invisible in a place that was not her home. But there was something different about the way this bucket pulled at her arms as she walked the frozen path toward the edge of the castle grounds. The water inside it had already begun to form a thin skin of ice at the surface, and the rags draped over her shoulder smelled of lye and cold stone. The sky above the mountains was the color of a bruise, deep violet fading into the pale gray of early morning, and the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like breathing. She had not been told what the den would smell like. Nobody had warned her about that. Not the head servant, not the guards who had given her the assignment with eyes that barely concealed their amusement, not the young kitchen girl who had pressed her lips together and looked away when Georgina received her punishment. The smell reached her before she reached the iron gate. Something ancient and dark, the musk of creatures who had known violence so intimately it had become part of their scent. Beneath it, something rawer, the smell of pain that had curdled into something else entirely. Her footsteps slowed. The gate itself was enormous, black iron set into the mountainside, reinforced with chains as thick as her wrist. Frost had crept across the metal in fractal patterns, and somewhere beyond it, in the cave carved deep into the rock, she could hear them. Not howling. That would have been ordinary, almost manageable. It was subtler than howling. A low, resonant sound, half breath, half growl, that seemed to vibrate in the space between her ribs. Georgina set the bucket down on the frozen ground. She stood still for a moment, her white hair lifting in the wind, her red servant's dress entirely wrong for this cold, for this place, for this particular morning in this particular kingdom, where she had always been the woman no one truly noticed. She thought about what the supervisor had said. "You'll be back before the first bell." He'd meant it as a taunt. He'd meant, "You will run, just like the others." He'd meant, "You are nothing." Her jaw tightened. She picked up the bucket. The guard at the gate had the expression of a man watching someone walk toward a fire. His hand hovered near the lock with a strange hesitation, as though he wasn't sure whether letting her in was mercy or cruelty. "You understand," he began, "that we cannot come in after you if—" "Open the gate," Georgina said quietly. He opened the gate. The cave was deeper than she had imagined. The ceiling rose high above her, rock formations hanging down like teeth, and the floor sloped inward and away, disappearing into a darkness that the faint torchlight mounted near the entrance did not fully reach. The walls were scarred, great gouges in the stone at shoulder height, repeated, rhythmic, the marks of something massive working its frustration into the rock over years and years. The smell was overwhelming now. She breathed through it deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe through difficult things, slowly, with intention, letting the body understand that it would not be destroyed by sensation alone. Then she saw them. They emerged from the dark gradually, the way stars appear at dusk. First one, then another, until suddenly the cave was full of presence. The ferals were enormous. That was the first thing. And it never quite became ordinary, no matter how many times she would later stand in that same entrance and remind herself of it. They were not like the wolves that ran in the forests beyond the kingdom's northern borders, lean and precise in their movements. These creatures were built differently, their frames heavy with something that went beyond muscle, their coats thick and tangled, their eyes catching the torchlight in colors that seemed to shift. Amber, then green, then something nearly red. One of them stepped forward. It was the largest, a male with a scar running from his left shoulder across the top of his head, fur matted and dark. He moved with a deliberateness that was worse than aggression. It was assessment. He was deciding something about her. Every instinct she had, every voice in the back of her mind that had been shaped by years of self-preservation, told her to step back, to make herself small, to retreat toward the gate before the guard changed his mind about leaving it slightly ajar. Georgina did not step back. Instead, She did the thing that had always been natural to her and incomprehensible to everyone around her. She lowered herself slowly, one knee touching the cold stone floor, until she was no longer upright and tall and strange and threatening, until she was smaller than the creature in front of her, visibly, deliberately smaller. And she spoke. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube. Extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. Not commands. Not the sharp syllables of someone trying to assert control. She spoke the way she had spoken to a dying cat she'd found in the market square when she was 7 years old. The way she'd spoken to the horses when the stable master was drunk and angry, and the animal's eyes had gone white with fear. She spoke the way water moves around stone. "You don't know me yet," she murmured. "That's all right. I don't know you either. We have some time." The feral stopped moving. His head tilted. The low sound in his chest changed pitch, not softening exactly, but becoming something more like a question than a statement. Behind him, the others were still, watching. Georgina remained kneeling on the cold stone, her bucket beside her, her rags on her shoulder, the lye smell mixing now with the ancient musk of the den, and she waited. She had learned patience the way some people learn arithmetic. Through necessity, through failure, through the gradual accumulation of understanding that some things cannot be rushed. The large feral took another step toward her. Then he lowered his massive head, and she felt the heat of his breath against the side of her face. She did not flinch. Something in the cave exhaled. She began to work. It was slow at first. She moved carefully, without sudden gestures, narrating her actions quietly as she did them. Moving the bucket here, setting the rags there, beginning with the far corner of the cave where the debris had accumulated, and working gradually inward. The ferals tracked her movement with those shifting eyes, repositioning themselves as she moved, but none of them came close enough to obstruct her. None of them showed teeth. By mid-morning, 3 of them were lying down. By the time the pale winter sun had climbed as high as it would climb that day, 2 of the smaller ones had come close enough for her to see the texture of their fur, the individual scars along their flanks, the way one of them favored her left rear leg with a barely perceptible hitch in her movement. Georgina paused her work and looked at that one directly. "Hurt," she said simply. Not a question. The feral's ear flicked. The guard returned at midday, presumably expecting to find a body or an empty cave. What he found instead stopped him in the entrance with his mouth open, incapable of forming words. Georgina was on her hands and knees scrubbing the far corner of the den, and around her, arranged with the casual certainty of creatures who have decided a thing and see no reason to revisit the decision, lay 6 of the ferals. Not sleeping, not unconscious. Simply present. Simply still. The guard's hand moved toward the gate behind him. The large, scarred male lifted his head and looked directly at the guard. The guard did not come in. He left instead, his boots making quick sounds on the frozen path back toward the castle, and Georgina heard him go without looking up from her work. She knew what he would report. She had known since the first hour in the cave that there would be reporting, that this would not remain a private thing between herself and these wounded creatures in their dark stone home. She had simply chosen not to let the future interrupt the present. The present was the stone floor, and the bucket, and the careful breathing of the wolves around her. She worked until the light began to fail. When she finally stood and gathered her things and walked back toward the gate, the large scarred male stood also and walked with her to the entrance and remained there watching as she made her way back up the frozen path toward the castle. She did not look back, but she felt it. That attention, heavy and strangely warm for a cold day, following her all the way until the path turned and the gate disappeared from view. The news moved through the castle the way news always moves in places where people are bored and frightened and in need of stories. Quickly, imprecisely, amplified by each retelling into something more extraordinary than the truth, which was itself already extraordinary enough. By evening, the story had been told in the kitchens, in the guard barracks, in the narrow stone corridors where the lesser servants lived. By the following morning, it had reached the upper floors. Carius Polaris heard it from his general, who told it with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that the Alpha King does not appreciate embellishment, but also does not appreciate the omission of significant details. "The girl went in," the general said. "The ferals did not harm her. She cleaned the den. When the guard went back to check on her at midday, she was scrubbing the floor while 6 of the ferals rested around her. She stayed until dark." Carius was standing at the window of his study, looking out over the mountain range that bordered his kingdom to the north. The peaks were white, permanently white, even in the months when the valley below turned green. He had always found something clarifying about that permanence. The mountains did not change depending on who was watching them. He did not turn from the window. "The same girl they sent yesterday?" "Yes. Georgina Moonfire. A servant. Young, 24. She's been with the household staff for about 3 years, mostly minor work. No history of trouble, no training with animals that anyone knows of." "And she goes back today?" There was a brief pause. "She was there before first light." Now he turned. Not quickly. Carius Polaris did nothing quickly that did not require speed. His movements had the deliberateness of a large animal that has learned long ago that its own weight is sufficient presence without addition. He was a tall man, broad through the chest and shoulders, the kind of frame that clothing struggled to contain gracefully. His hair was black and long, often pulled back, but sometimes loose around his face, and he kept a short beard that had more silver in it than he was generally inclined to acknowledge. His eyes were dark, nearly black themselves, and they held the particular quality of someone who had spent years watching things rather than participating in them. "I'll go," he said. His general did not argue, though Carius could see the small muscular response of a man suppressing the impulse to argue. He had good generals precisely because they knew when not to argue. He went alone except for 4 guards, which was as close to alone as a king could reasonably travel on his own grounds. The morning was sharp, the kind of cold that entered through the lungs and reminded the body of its own particular fragility. He walked the frozen path at a pace that made the guards work to keep up without breaking into a jog, and as he walked, he thought about the ferals. He had been the one to order their capture. 3 years ago, when the last of the border wars had exhausted itself into a sullen ceasefire, the wolves who had been living in the contested territories had been changed by something he did not have a word for that was not simply violence, and violence seemed insufficient. They were larger than they should have been. Their aggression was not territorial or hunger-driven in the way a wolf's aggression should be. It seemed instead existential, as if they had decided that the world was a hostile thing and were responding in kind. He had ordered them brought in because leaving them outside the borders was not safe, and killing them had felt wrong. He had not examined why it had felt wrong. He simply had not given the order to kill, and the generals had not pushed him, and the ferals had been placed in the cave near the mountain wall, and twice a week someone slid raw meat through a slot at the base of the iron gate, and that was the accommodation they had arrived at. It was not, he had always privately known, a satisfying accommodation. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice exactly. More the quality of sound in the cave, the way the ambient noise of the den had shifted from what he remembered during his single previous inspection. The low, agitated sounds, the shifting movement, the constant low-grade tension of creatures in a state of sustained distress. What reached him now through the open gate was different. Quieter. Less like a battlefield before the first shot, and more like... He searched for a comparison and found, unexpectedly, the memory of his mother's garden in summer, when the bees were in the lavender and everything was at work and at peace simultaneously. He stepped through the gate. Georgina was in the center of the cave, her back partially toward him, speaking in a low, continuous voice while she sorted through a pile of old straw and debris, separating what could be salvaged from what needed to be removed. Her white hair was loose, falling over her shoulder, vivid against the red of her dress even in the dim cave light. 3 ferals were within arm's reach of her, close enough to touch, close enough to have killed her in the time it would have taken anyone outside to react. One of the guards behind Carius made a small sound. His hand moved toward his weapon. The large scarred male raised his head. The sound in the cave changed. Before anyone could react, before the guard's hand completed its movement, Georgina stood from her crouch, turned with the unhurried calm of someone who has already assessed every relevant variable in the room, and raised one hand with her palm facing the feral. Her eyes, Carius noted, were gray. Very light gray, almost silver, and they moved between the feral and the guard, with an expression that was not fear, but something adjacent to exasperation. The particular exasperation of someone who is managing a situation and would prefer that other people not introduce new variables into it. The large male lowered his head. The guard with the weapon frozen halfway to its holster stood absolutely still. One of the younger warriors at the back of the group murmured, low and reverent and disbelieving, "She controls them." Carius looked at Georgina. She had not moved. She was watching the large feral with that still, concentrated attention, one hand still raised, and the quality of that attention was... He found himself searching for the word, and then finding it with a slight sense of surprise. Tender. It was the quality of attention you gave to something you genuinely cared about. She doesn't control anything. His voice filled the cave the way his voice always filled spaces. Completely, without effort. The voice of a man who had commanded armies in open fields and never needed to raise it. Georgina turned toward him fully for the first time, and he held her gaze for a moment that was longer than he intended. Then he added, with a firmness that seemed to emerge from somewhere below conscious thought, somewhere older and more certain than reason. They respect her. Because she is mine. No one in the cave moved, least of all Georgina, who looked at him with those silver eyes and an expression he could not easily categorize. Not offense, not confusion, not the particular complicated anxiety of a servant hearing something unexpected from a king. Something more thoughtful than any of those things. Something that looked almost like recognition. He was the first to look away. He walked further into the cave, and the ferals tracked him with their eyes but did not move, which was itself unusual. He had been in this den exactly once before, and on that occasion the creatures had not been hostile, but had been watchful in the manner of something that had not yet decided. Now they watched him with the kind of stillness that held no threat. He noticed, walking the perimeter, that the floor was cleaner than it had been. The debris near the walls had been cleared. Fresh straw had been laid in the sleeping areas. "You've been here since before first light," he said, not quite a question. "There's quite a lot to do." Her voice, he noted, was quiet without being deferential. She spoke to him the way she'd spoken to the feral, directly, without performance. "You're not afraid of them." "They've given me no reason to be afraid of them." A small pause. "They were given reason to be afraid of everything else." He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the large scarred male, who had settled back into his resting position, with the air of a creature whose opinion of the current situation was provisionally acceptable. "You understand what they are?" Carius asked. "What happened to them?" "I understand they've been hurt." She met his gaze. "And that hurt animals are not the same thing as dangerous animals, even when they look the same from the outside." He was quiet for a moment. The cave breathed around them. "That," he said at last, "is a more generous interpretation than most people extend to them." Most people don't spend time with them. The faintest note of something in her voice, not challenge, more like observation. You can't understand something you've decided to fear from a distance. He should have left. He had come out of curiosity, out of the practical necessity of a king who needed to understand unusual things that were happening on his grounds, and he had seen what he came to see, and there was no compelling reason to remain in a cave that smelled of musk and cold stone while a servant in a red dress explained animal psychology to him. He stayed for another hour. They talked about the ferals. She had been observing them, noting individual behaviors, beginning to understand their social structure, which was not simple. The large scarred male, she had concluded, was not the most dominant among them, despite appearing so. There was a female, darker coated and quieter, whose approval the others sought in subtle ways. Carius listened to this with genuine interest, because he knew the dynamics of pack hierarchy well, and what she was describing was accurate and perceptive in a way that required real attention to arrive at. He found himself asking questions. She found herself answering them fully, without the careful hedging that servants typically used when speaking to him, the constant self-interruption, the checking of his expression, the reflexive, "Of course, my lord," that people used as punctuation to make clear that their own opinion could be discarded if inconvenient. She simply answered, and then, once, she asked him a question in return. Had the ferals been given any space to run, beyond the cave? Did the iron gate ever open? He realized with a small and not entirely comfortable clarity that the answer was no. "They need to run," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement about animals, about bodies designed for movement, about the particular cruelty of stillness. But it settled somewhere in him with weight. When he finally turned to leave, the large scarred male stood and walked with him to the cave entrance, the same way Carius would later learn that the wolf had walked Georgina to the gate the previous evening. He stood at the entrance a moment, looking back into the cave where she had returned to her work, her white head bent, her red dress moving softly as she worked. "Moonfire," he said. She looked up. "The gate can be opened. The forest behind the north wall. They can run there, if you'll go with them." She looked at him for a moment with those silver eyes, and something in her expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but held all the warmth of one. "I'll go with them," she said. He walked back to the castle with the sensation, unfamiliar and faintly disconcerting, that something had changed, not dramatically. Not in the way that battles change things, or deaths change things, the hinge moments that divided life into before and after. Something smaller, a degree of shift in some internal compass he hadn't known he'd been consulting. He did not examine it too closely. He came back the next day, and the day after that. The official reason evolved through several iterations. First, a simple need to assess the feral's condition. Then, a standing inspection that any responsible leader might conduct. Then something vaguer that he did not articulate even to himself. The generals noticed. His council noticed, or at least they noticed, that he was spending time near the north wall, and they drew their own conclusions with the careful discretion of people who have learned that drawing visible conclusions about a king's behavior is a form of political risk. What no one noticed, because no one knew to look for it, was the way his expression changed inside the cave. Outside it, on the training ground, in the council chamber, in the formal receiving hall where he conducted the business of ruling a kingdom in ice and mountains. His face held the particular configuration that years of command had carved into it. Steady, assessing, intentional. It was a face that gave nothing away and asked for nothing. It was a face that had watched people die and made decisions that others could not make, and carried the weight of all of that without visible strain, because visible strain in a king is visible weakness, and visible weakness is invitation. Inside the cave, sitting on a flat rock near the sleeping ferals while Georgina talked about what she had observed that morning. His face did something different. The lines around his eyes softened. The set of his jaw released. He looked, though no one was there to catalog it, like a man who was simply present in a moment, without requiring the moment to be anything other than what it was. She noticed. She was perceptive in the way of people who have spent their lives being overlooked. They develop attention as compensation, a habit of seeing what others don't bother to look for. She noticed the difference, and she did not remark on it, but she calibrated her behavior to it. In the subtle way she calibrated everything. She was easier with him in the cave than she was in any hallway or corridor of the castle where she had to recompose into the small, quiet servant. Here she was, simply herself, and that self was curious and direct and given to observations that arrived every now and then with a dry precision that made him want to laugh and occasionally did. The laughter surprised him every time, not because it was unfamiliar. He was not by nature a humorless man, though 2 years of grief had thickened a certain solemnity around everything, but because it felt as if it came from somewhere that had been closed. As if she had found a door he had forgotten existed and simply walked through it without asking permission, because she had no way of knowing that doors like that were supposed to be locked, she told him. One afternoon when the ferals were running in the forest behind the north wall, and they were standing together watching from the tree line, about her childhood. She spoke of it without self-pity, which was the mode she seemed to move through most difficult things, with a kind of clear-eyed steadiness that acknowledged reality without kneeling to it. She had grown up poor, she said, in a village 3 days' travel from the castle. Her mother had died when she was 11. She had worked since she was old enough to carry a bucket, which in her accounting was approximately age 5, though she admitted this was possibly an exaggeration. She had come to the castle because it was either that or marry a man twice her age with a drinking problem and a temper, and she had chosen the bucket. He listened to all of this and felt something he recognized reluctantly as anger. Not at her, but at the shape of the world that produced that particular set of choices for a person with her qualities, her clarity, her quiet, extraordinary competence with things that defied competence. And no one, he said carefully, thought to give you something more than small tasks. She tilted her head, a gesture she made when she was considering how honest to be. No one noticed, my lord. I was useful and quiet. Useful and quiet is a kind of invisibility. Don't call me that here. She looked at him. My lord, he clarified, not here. What should I call you here? The question hung between them for a moment, and the ferals ran between the pine trees, their dark forms flickering in and out of view, and the sky above the mountains was the deep, clear blue that only appeared in winter when the clouds departed and the cold became absolute. Carius, he said. She said his name once, quietly, as if testing the shape of it. Then she went back to watching the wolves, and he went back to watching the wolves, and neither of them said anything more about it. But something had shifted that did not shift back. He began to tell her things. It happened gradually, the way all true intimacy happens gradually. Not as a decision, but as an accumulation, each small truth making the next one more possible. He told her about the border wars, about the years of campaigns that had cost the kingdom more than territory or resources, had cost a generation of men their steadiness, their sleep, their ability to sit in a quiet room without looking for exits. He told her about the difficulty of making peace when the people who made the war were not the people who negotiated the ceasefire, and the people who negotiated the ceasefire were not the people who lived with the consequences. He told her about governance, the relentless daily weight of it, the decisions that could not be undone, the space between what was possible and what was right that a leader had to navigate every single day, alone, because the loneliness of the top position was not incidental, but structural. She listened to all of this with the same quality of attention she gave the ferals, complete, non-judgmental, focused on understanding rather than on how to respond. She did not offer solutions or reassurances, because she seemed to understand that solutions and reassurances were not what was being asked for. What was being asked for was simply to be heard, and she was extraordinarily good at that. And then one evening, when they were sitting near the cave entrance with the stars beginning to appear above the mountain peaks, he told her about Aaron. He had not spoken her name aloud in a long time. He had thought it. He had thought it every day, still a reflexive checking of a place that was still raw. But speech was different from thought. Speech was the transformation of the interior into something shared, and sharing it required trusting the person you shared it with not to mishandle what you gave them. Aaron had been his queen for 7 years before the illness. She had been sharp and kind in equal measure, a woman who had ruled beside him with the particular combination of intelligence and will that he had recognized as kindred when he first encountered it, which was in the middle of a political argument at a council meeting 3 months after they met, where she had dismantled his position on regional taxation with a precision that had left him, for the first and nearly only time in his life, without an immediate response. He had asked her to walk with him after. 14 months later, they were married. The illness had come without announcement. That was the part he still could not make peace with. The absence of warning, the sense that something that large and consequential should have announced itself. It had begun with fatigue, which was easy to explain away, and progressed with a speed that stripped the possibility of acceptance before acceptance could arrive. 8 months between the first symptom and the last. He told all of this quietly, watching the stars appear one by one above the black shapes of the mountains, and Georgina sat beside him and listened. And at the part about the 8 months her hand moved. He felt it before he saw it, and rested on his arm. Not patting, not the gesture of comfort from a distance. Simply present, her hand on his arm, warm through his sleeve. He did not move away. The silence after, he said after a while, was the worst. I had never understood how much of the castle's sound came from one person moving through it. Her particular step, the way she opened certain doors, the sound of her voice in the morning, talking to the dogs. He paused. I kept finding myself listening for things that weren't there. For months. Do you still? Georgina asked. He considered the question honestly. Less, he said. Recently, less. She did not ask why. She seemed to know, or to understand, that the answer to that question was not something that required articulation. She simply nodded, and her hand remained on his arm, and above them, the stars multiplied into uncountability, and the mountains held the dark with their old indifference. He turned and looked at her then, in profile, the light from the cave entrance touching the side of her face, and the pale cascade of her hair. And something moved through him that he recognized even as he recognized it, was inconvenient. Not the simple comfort of proximity, not the relief of being heard, but something more specific, more pointed. The particular gravity of a person toward another person that is not chosen but simply is, like weather, like the mountains, like everything that exists prior to and independent of human preference. He said nothing. He looked away. But he knew. The castle began to notice. Castles always notice eventually. They are machines made of human observation. Every corridor a conduit for information. Every servant a recording device for things their employers believe go unremarked. Georgina felt it before she could have named it. A shift in the quality of attention she received in the kitchens, in the hallways, in the small dormitory room where the lower servants slept. Not hostile yet. Not quite. But watching. The watching became talk. The talk became the careful, deniable cruelty of people who frame their aggression as concern. Isn't it unusual how much time the king spends at the North Wall? Isn't it something, how a girl with no bloodline and no position seems to have acquired a certain access? The word access was delivered with a particular intonation that contained everything it was meant to contain. One of the senior noblewomen, the Lady Vessa, who had been a fixture of the court for 30 years and had accumulated that time into a kind of calcified authority, began discreetly to make remarks. Never direct enough to be challenged, always shaped with the careful imprecision of someone who wishes to plant a seed but not be seen planting it. She spoke of the late Queen's memory, of the dignity owed to it, of how quickly some people forget the appropriate distance between their station and their aspirations. Georgina heard these things the way she heard most difficult things, clearly, without flinching, and without allowing them to alter her behavior in ways she had not herself decided on. She had not sought this, had not sought any of it, the king's attention, the warmth of those cave evenings, the way her own chest had begun to respond to the sound of his step on the frozen path in a manner she recognized and could not simplify away. She had simply been herself, in a place where being herself was somehow possible, in a way it had rarely been, and what had grown from that was genuine enough that she refused to preemptively apologize for it. But she was not unaware of danger, and the danger, when it arrived, did not come from the direction she had been watching. It was 8 weeks after her first day in the cave, on a morning when the sky was the flat white of an approaching storm and the air tasted of iron. She had arrived at the den early, as had become her habit, and found the ferals more restless than usual. The weather, she suspected, the barometric change that animals felt in their bones before humans felt it in the air. She had been working to settle them, moving through the cave slowly, speaking in that low, continuous voice, when she heard boots on the stone path and then the sound of multiple men's voices, louder than necessary, in the deliberate way of people who want to be heard and wish their presence to register as power. 4 of the younger castle warriors came through the gate without asking. She knew them by sight. They ran together. That particular kind of young men who form a unit around shared bravado, who exist in relation to each other's approval in the specific way that requires constant performance. She had seen them eyeing the den before, the sideways looks of people who have decided they are unafraid of something and need witnesses to that decision. One of them, broad-shouldered, jaw set with the artificial confidence of someone not quite as certain as they appear, looked around the cave with exaggerated casualness. "So this is where the king's pet project happens," he said. The ferals had gone still. She turned to face the men, her voice quiet and even. "You should leave. We're just having a look." He moved further into the cave, and the movement was not exploratory but demonstrative. The deliberate transgression of someone who wants to see what happens when they transgress. "It's impressive, I'll say that. Trained them well." "They're not trained," she said. "And you should not be in here. Please leave." The king's little servant giving orders. He looked at his companions with that grin, seeking and receiving the confirmation of their own grins. "She thinks she runs the place." He picked up a rock from the cave floor. "Let's see how well they listen without her." "Don't do that." He threw the rock at the largest feral. The cave exploded. Not with sound first, but with motion. The sudden collective movement of 6 massive bodies, months of compression releasing all at once, the ferals rising from rest to full alert in the time it takes a breath to complete. The large scarred male was on his feet and advancing before the rock had stopped rolling, and behind him, the others surged forward, and the sound that came from them was nothing like the sound Georgina had ever heard in that cave before. Not the questioning growl, not the low, considering murmur, but something at the bottom of the auditory register that seemed to enter through the sternum rather than the ears. The warrior with the rock backed up fast and stumbled over his own feet. His companions had flattened themselves against the wall. Georgina moved. She walked directly into the space between the advancing ferals and the men. Not running, not gesturing wildly, just walking. The same steady, deliberate walk she had used from the first day. And she raised both hands not in command but in presence, and she spoke. "Hey, look at me. Look at me." The large male's eyes snapped to her. "Come here," she said. "Come." The growl changed pitch. "I know," she said, still moving toward him, closing the distance between them. "I know, but look at me. Look at me." He stopped. His sides were heaving. His eyes moved between her and the men at the wall with the wild oscillation of something at the edge of its own control. She reached him and placed both hands against the sides of his massive, scarred head, and she held his face and looked directly into those amber eyes that held everything he had been through, every battle and every loss and every year of the dark cave, and she let him see her, the steadiness of her, the unchanged quality of her regard, the simple fact that she was still here and still herself. "Easy," she said. "Easy." His breathing slowed. The others settled, following his lead, the way they always followed his lead when the signal was clear enough. Georgina straightened, turned to look at the 4 warriors against the wall, all of whom had the expressions of men who have just understood something about their own mortality that they had not fully understood before. "Get out," she said. They got out. She stood for a long time afterward in the center of the cave with her hands not quite steady, the aftermath of adrenaline working through her system like cold water through rock, slow and thorough and fundamentally changing the shape of things. The large feral pressed against her side, his great weight a warmth she leaned into without entirely meaning to. She did not cry. She did not have enough room in her at the moment for what she was feeling, which was something more complex than fear, and more complicated than relief. Something about the necessity of standing in the space between things that could destroy each other, and being herself, whatever it was that made them not destroy each other. Something about how strange and how costly it was to be a person whose particular gift was for that space. She was still there when Carius arrived. He had heard. He had been told, not by the warriors who had slipped back to their quarters with a silence born of shame, but by a junior guard who had been posted at the outer gate and had seen them enter and heard what followed, and had made the decision, a brave one, to go directly to the king. Carius came through the gate alone, leaving his escort outside, and found Georgina sitting on the flat rock in the center of the cave with the large feral's head in her lap, and 5 other wolves arranged around her like planets around a sun. He stood at the entrance for a moment. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her eyes were composed, that silver steadiness intact. But he had come to know her well enough now to read below it, to the tremor that was not visible, but was present, the particular quality of stillness in someone who was holding themselves together with effort. He crossed the cave and sat beside her on the flat rock. Neither of them spoke for a while. The large feral opened one amber eye, registered Carius, and closed it again, which was itself a kind of statement about how much things had changed. "You were not hurt," Carius said finally. "No. The warriors will answer for what they did." "I know." A pause. I'm not asking you to handle it." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm telling you that I will, because what they did was wrong. And not only because it could have harmed you, because it could have undone something that took months to build." He looked at her. "Because they had no right to be in here. This is yours." She looked at him at that, a quick, unguarded look, and in it he saw something he recognized. Surprise. The particular surprise of someone who has not been told often enough that the things they create belong to them, that the work they do has a value that transcends utility, that what they have made is worth protecting. He felt the anger move through him again, the specific anger that had been building across weeks, that was no longer abstract but personal, no longer about injustice in principle, but about this person, this particular life. "Georgina," he said. She waited. He had thought about how to say this, had turned it over and looked at it from various angles the way he looked at everything consequential, systematically, trying to understand it before speaking it. He had thought about timing, about propriety, about the gap between their positions and what it meant, and whether it could be bridged. He had thought about Aaron, and what Aaron would have said, and what he believed she would have said was, "Do not let grief teach you that love is something you only get once, "What I said," he began, "the first day I came here, that they respect you because you are mine." He watched her face carefully. "I want to tell you that I didn't say that as a king asserting ownership of a servant. I said it because something in me recognized something in you that I had no words for yet. And those were the words that came out. And they were not wrong. They were imprecise, but not wrong." He paused. "I am not explaining this well." "You're explaining it fine," she said quietly. "What I mean to say is that I have been coming to this cave every day for 2 months, he continued, "and not for the reasons I first said, and not for the reasons I told my generals. I have been coming because this is the only place in my kingdom where I feel entirely present, where I am not managing something or deciding something or being watched as a function rather than a person." He turned to look at her fully. "Where you are." The cave was very quiet. The ferals breathed around them. The storm that had been building was arriving now, the first sound of it reaching them through the rock. Wind against the mountain face, the particular high note of a winter storm finding its voice. "I am aware," he said, "of what I am asking, of the distance between us and how it would look and what people would say, and I am not asking you to ignore any of that. I am only asking you to know that what I am saying is true. That in 2 months you have taken something in me that was very cold and very still and made it—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Move again." She was looking at him with that look he could not quite categorize, the one that seemed to contain recognition, and something deeper than recognition. Something like the understanding of a thing that has been inevitable for longer than either party knows. "I should tell you," she said, "that for most of my life, I have been very easy to forget. And I have made my peace with that. But I have found, recently, that I very much do not want you to forget me." The storm arrived fully then, the wind filling the cave entrance with a sound like breath, and the torches along the walls guttered and steadied. Incarius Polaris lifted his hand and moved a strand of white hair from Georgina's face, with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with everything the world knew about him and entirely consistent with everything she had come to know. And she leaned slightly, barely perceptibly, into that touch. Outside, the mountains held the storm the way they held everything, with patience, with permanence, with the profound and total indifference of things that have existed long enough to understand that weather passes. Inside, in the warmth of the den, something began. The castle, as castles do, observed. What it observed was this. The Alpha King, who had been spoken of for 2 years in the particular hushed tones people reserve for grief when it becomes chronic, began to change, not dramatically, not in a way that could be identified in any single moment, but in the accumulation of small signs that constituted, for those who knew how to read them, something significant. He was present in council meetings in a way he had not been, not simply physically present, but present in the engaged, processing way that produced decisions rather than adjournments. He walked the castle grounds in the early morning again, which he had stopped doing after Aaron's death. He asked questions about the state of the villages, the welfare of people beyond the mountain passes, the children in the training program, questions that had their answers followed up on, which meant he actually wanted the information, and not just the appearance of wanting it. The generals noticed. The senior staff noticed. Even the kitchen workers noticed, which was the most reliable indicator, because kitchen workers have an accuracy about the emotional temperature of a household that political advisors rarely match. What the castle also observed was Georgina. She continued her work with the ferals, which had expanded now to include regular runs in the forest, the slow work of addressing the injured female's leg. A thorn abscess, it turned out, which required patience and time, and a particular poultice that Georgina had researched with the focused determination she brought to all things, and a kind of general advocacy for the feral's welfare that she conducted without fanfare, but with unmistakable consistency. She spoke about them to anyone who would listen, not with the evangelical fervor of a convert, but with the calm authority of someone who has direct knowledge and is simply conveying it. Several of the younger guards began asking her questions. One of the stable workers started coming to watch from a careful distance and stopped recoiling at the sound of the ferals. She was still a servant. She wore her red dress and carried her bucket and scrubbed the den floor, and there was nothing in the formal structure of her position that had changed. And yet, something in how she occupied space had shifted. Some internal adjustment, some settling of her spine into its full height, that was perceptible without being articulable. Carius watched this shift with something that was not quite pride, but inhabited the same neighborhood. The Lady Vessa watched it with something that did not inhabit that neighborhood at all. The gathering of opposition was not sudden. It was the work of weeks. Conversations in the right rooms with the right people. Careful insinuations delivered in the language of concern and tradition and the preservation of the kingdom's dignity. The argument, at its core, was not complex. A woman of no bloodline, no family, no position, no history, a servant, had acquired inappropriate closeness to the king, and this closeness was destabilizing, and something should be done about it. What was proposed, delivered to Carius in a formal council session through the mouth of one of Vessa's allied lords, who had the expression of a man performing a duty he would rather not have been assigned, was a reassignment. Georgina Moonfire would be transferred to a household in another part of the kingdom. A decent posting, comfortable, nothing punitive about it on the surface. The ferals could be managed going forward by trained animal handlers. Carius listened to this with the stillness that preceded his most dangerous moods, the absolute, airless quiet that people who knew him well had learned to read as warning rather than equanimity. "And the ferals' welfare?" he said, when the Lord had finished. The Lord blinked. "As I said, trained handlers." "I heard you." He let a beat of silence fall. "Do the trained handlers know about the abscess on the female's rear leg? Do they know which of the wolves is actually dominant versus which appears dominant? Do they know what to do when a storm is coming and the barometric change agitates the pack?" Another pause. "Do they know anything at all about what is actually happening in that den, or are they simply trained to not be killed by it?" The Lord had no answer. Carius's gaze moved around the council table and rested briefly on Vessa, who held it with the composed fearlessness of someone who believes they have right on their side. "I understand," Carius said, "that there is concern about appearances. I understand that my proximity to a member of the household staff seems, from the outside, irregular. I am not unaware of how it looks." He straightened in his chair, the full measure of himself coming into his posture, and the council felt it the way rooms always felt it when Carius Polaris decided to stop managing himself down to fit a space. "But I will tell you what I know. What I know is that this woman walked into a place that broke trained soldiers, and she walked out with the trust of creatures that no one else has been able to approach. What I know is that she has done more for those ferals in 8 weeks than 2 years of management accomplished. What I know is that the insight, the compassion, and the extraordinary patience that this work requires does not arrive from training or bloodline or family history. It arrives from character." He looked at the table. "I would counsel this council to be very careful about the precedent it sets when it suggests that character is insufficient qualification." The session was adjourned without resolution, which was Carius's way of ending debates he found both necessary and entirely settled in his own mind. He went to the den that evening. Georgina knew something had happened. She had the instincts of someone accustomed to reading the emotional weather of a household, and the quality of tension in the castle that day had been unmistakable. She looked up when he came through the gate, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down what she was doing and give him her full attention. "There was a council session," he said. She waited. "There was a proposal to move you to another posting." He watched her face. "I refused it." Something moved through her expression quickly. Something she did not quite contain. Not the thing itself, but the aftermath of trying to contain it. A faint fragmentation of composure that reassembled almost instantly. "You didn't have to." "I know. I would have understood if..." "Georgina." He said her name with a directness that stopped the sentence. There is nothing about this that requires your preemptive understanding. I refused because I wanted to refuse, because the proposal was politically motivated and practically absurd, and because... He stopped. Let a beat pass. Because I have no interest in a castle that does not contain you. The den was quiet around them. The ferals were settling into their evening postures. The gradual subsidence of large bodies toward rest. She looked at him with those silver eyes, and all that stillness that he had come to understand was not passivity, but the kind of strength that doesn't need movement to demonstrate itself. You're going to make things very complicated, she said softly. Yes, he agreed. Probably. The faintest curve of her lips. All right then. He reached out, and she came toward him, and when his hands found her face, the gentleness in them was the same gentleness that had always been there, the same thing she had been watching for months in the way he moved through the cave, careful and deliberate, never rough where rough was not needed. She had known for some time, that this was who he was when no one was watching. Not the king the world feared, but the man who had loved one person completely and lost her, and was here again, against every expectation of his own grief, finding himself capable of something he thought he had finished. She pressed her forehead against his, just that, for a moment, and felt his exhale, long and slow, and releasing something that had been held for a very long time. The large scarred feral lifted his head, looked at them with amber eyes, and laid his head back down. The opposition did not dissolve. Genuine opposition to things that challenge the established order rarely simply dissolves. It goes underground, it regroups, it looks for better leverage. What Vesa and her allies had not been able to accomplish through the council, they attempted through social pressure, through the careful orchestration of public sentiment, through the cultivation of a narrative that was harder to counter than a formal proposal. The narrative of impropriety, of a king in grief making poor decisions, of a young woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain, maneuvering her way into a position she had not earned. The narrative found some willing ears. It always does. Georgina encountered it in its various forms. The averted eyes of servants who had previously nodded to her, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way invitations to small informal gatherings that had previously included her now did not. She absorbed these things without reaction, which was both genuine and strategic. She understood that reaction was fuel, that any visible wound would be interpreted as evidence of vulnerability or guilt, and she had no guilt to evidence. She continued her work. She continued her conversations with the guards who had come to appreciate the ferals. She continued treating every person in the castle with the same quiet evenness she had always offered, not because it was politic, but because it was simply who she was. But there were nights when the weight of it was heavier than she let it appear, nights when she sat in the den after her work was done, and the ferals were settled, and the quality of the silence pressed in from all sides, and she let herself feel what she had been not feeling during the day. The loneliness that was different from the loneliness she had known before. The loneliness of having something precious and being aware at all times of how precarious its purchase on the world was. The fear, which she did not often let herself examine directly, that the world would find a way to take this from her the way it had taken other things. That love arrived in her life, with an expiration. On one of these evenings, she was surprised. She had not heard him come. He moved with a quietness that defied his size, and she only knew he was there when the large feral's tail lifted and moved in its peculiar greeting gesture. And she turned to find Carius in the cave entrance, holding 2 cups of something hot that steamed in the cold air. He looked at her face and understood something of what it held. He sat beside her and gave her one of the cups and said nothing for a long time, and the ferals breathed around them, and the steam rose from the cups, and somewhere above the mountain the stars were making their slow transit. "You're allowed to find this difficult," he said finally. "I know," Not just for appearances. Not just because it's politically inconvenient. He looked at her. Because it is actually difficult, and you are allowed to say so. She held the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth of it. I don't want you to think I'm not. I know you're not. She was quiet for a moment. I grew up being told that wanting things was a luxury I couldn't afford, she said at last. That the safest thing was not to want, not to need, not to reach for anything that could be taken away. And now? She looked at him with those silver eyes, and in them was everything. The history of her. The careful accumulated architecture of a person who had protected herself so long that she had almost stopped being aware of the protections, and now was aware of every one of them, because every single one of them was being quietly dismantled by the simple ongoing fact of him. Now I'm reaching, she said. He put his arm around her then, and she leaned into his side, and the den held them both in its old stone warmth, and the wolves slept, and nothing that was difficult disappeared, but the weight of it distributed itself differently, across 2 sets of shoulders instead of 1, which is the original and still most effective magic of love. The crisis, when it finally arrived, was not subtle. It came in the form of Lord Edrath, Vessa's primary ally, a man whose grievances with Carius predated Georgina entirely, but had found in this situation a useful vessel for their expression. He arrived at the den on a morning when neither Carius nor the usual guards were present, accompanied by 6 of his own men and the stated purpose of conducting a safety assessment of the ferals. The actual purpose was demonstration. He had decided, or been advised, that a public incident involving the ferals, something that could be reported as evidence that the situation was dangerous, that the king's protection of it was reckless, that Georgina's apparent control of the animals was an illusion, would provide exactly the political leverage needed. He had brought devices for the purpose. Cages within cages, designed to agitate. Specific sounds. The particular cruelty that humans are capable of when they have convinced themselves they are serving a principle. Georgina saw it happening before she could stop it, and she moved, not away, but toward. The ferals rose. Edrath's men went for their weapons. She positioned herself between them and the animals, and what she did was simply extraordinary. She held that position, alone, without backup, her red dress a single burning point of color between the gray stone and the moving gray shapes of the wolves, and she spoke into the gathering chaos with that voice that was not louder than the chaos but somehow cut through it, clear and steady as a line on a horizon. The large scarred male reached her. She held his face in her hands. Everything around her was still moving. Edrath's men shouting, the other ferals circling the perimeter, the sound of weapons being drawn. And she was utterly, absolutely still at the center of it, looking into amber eyes, and she said, "Not today. Stay with me. Stay." The wolf trembled under her hands. The trembling stilled. He exhaled. Carius arrived to find the following. Edrath and his men backed against the wall, disarmed, not by any human agent, but by the ferals who had herded them there in the way wolves herd things they have decided to contain rather than destroy. And Georgina standing in the center of the cave with her hand on the large feral's head, composed and white-haired in her red dress, looking at Edrath with an expression that contained no anger at all, only a kind of exhausted, clear-eyed calm. Carius looked at all of this. He looked at the man against the wall who had come here with cruelty and devices, and the conviction that a woman and a pack of wolves were things to be manipulated for political purpose. He looked at Georgina. Something settled in him, permanently, the way foundations settle. Not a movement, but a becoming still. A final, absolute knowing. He turned to Edrath. What he said in that moment was not for the narrative of the castle or the positioning of political leverage. It was simply true, said in his full voice, in the way that things are said when they come from the place beneath strategy. "Lord Edrath," he said, "you will leave my kingdom before nightfall. This is not a request." Edrath opened his mouth. Carius did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Before nightfall," he said again, "or I will allow these animals to make the decision themselves, and I will find I have very little inclination to repeat the request." Edrath left. Carius crossed the cave to where Georgina stood, and his hands found her face the way they had before, and he looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. The full, searching look of a man taking inventory of someone he cannot stand the thought of losing. "Are you hurt?" "No." He exhaled. His forehead came to rest against hers, brief and fierce, and very much not the controlled behavior of a king in a formal setting. "I need you to know," he said against her hair, "that I am done negotiating with anyone about this." She pulled back slightly to look at him. "About what?" "About you." He held her gaze. "About what you are to me and what I intend to do about it." The wolves around them were still. The large scarred male had moved to lie near their feet, with the proprietary contentment of an animal who has decided this situation is now acceptable. "What do you intend to do about it?" she asked quietly. He took her hands. He held them with a steadiness that was also urgency, the particular combination of a man who has thought carefully and arrived and intends to stay arrived. "I intend," he said, "to ask you to be my queen." The cave was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She thought, in that silence, about the girl who had grown up in a village 3 days' walk from this mountain, who had learned early that wanting was dangerous and reaching was reckless, and the safest architecture of a life was small and contained and not too visible. She thought about all the distances she had traveled to arrive at this particular moment, in this particular cave with this particular man, and how none of the distances had been the kind that appear on maps. She thought about the ferals and what they had taught her, not about danger, but about the difference between what a creature appears to be and what it actually is, about what happens when something wounded and wild is offered, instead of more violence, a steady hand and an unchanging voice, and the radical proposition that it is safe to come closer. She thought about the way he had sat with her in the cold and the dark, and not asked her to be less than she was. She looked at him, at the black-haired, dark-eyed king who was fierce for the world and gentle for her, who had shown her 1,000 times over the distance between the face he gave to everything else, and the face he had for this cave, for these wolves, for the hours they had talked under stars while the mountains held still. And she felt something rise in her that was not performance, not politeness, not the careful management of something precious held at arm's length from the possibility of loss. It was simply yes, whole and uncomplicated and very old, as if some part of her had known the answer to this question long before the question existed. "Yes," she said. He pressed his lips to her forehead, the gentleness of it disproportionate to the size of the moment. And then he held her, and the cave held them both, and the large scarred feral made a sound very low in his chest that was not a growl, but something more like acknowledgement, like a witness certifying what it had seen. The formal declaration was made before the full court, on a morning when the winter light fell clean and white through the high windows of the great hall, turning every surface into something both colder and more luminous than itself. Carius had refused all counsel about the language of the announcement. He knew what he wanted to say, and he said it. He said that Georgina Moonfire was to be his queen, and that he wished the court to understand the basis on which this decision had been made. He said that for 2 years he had ruled this kingdom in grief, and that grief had narrowed him in ways he had not entirely recognized until something came along that widened him again. He said that what had widened him was not lineage or title or political alliance. It was the quality of a person. He said that Georgina had walked into the place everyone else feared, carrying nothing but herself, and had done something that no military strategy or royal decree had been able to do. She had offered the ferals a reason to trust, and in doing so, she had reminded a king who had forgotten, briefly but significantly, what the whole enterprise of ruling a kingdom was supposed to be for. He said that the woman who had returned life to a place everyone had written off as lost was also the woman who had returned life to him. He said that he did not require the court's approval, but that he hoped they would, in time, understand. Georgina stood beside him in a dress that was no longer red. They had given her the choice, and she had chosen white, a deliberate echo of the world's understanding of her, a decision she had made with the private certainty that some things you do not leave behind but carry forward, transformed. And she looked out at the assembled court with the same quality of steady attention she brought to everything, and when his hand found hers in the formal gesture of presentation, she held it back with a firmness that said everything she would not have been able to articulate. Lady Vessa was present. She stood in her assigned place with the expression of someone practicing dignified defeat. She did not speak. She would not speak against this. Georgina understood, not because she had changed her mind, but because she was a practical woman who had arrived at the edge of what opposition could accomplish, and the view from there had clarified her options. The large hall filled with a sound that was not quite applause and not quite silence, a kind of collective inhale and exhale, the sound of a room adjusting to a new reality, feeling the edges of it, beginning the slow process of accommodation. In the months that followed, the adjustment was not seamless. Adjustments never are, not when they require the renegotiation of fundamental assumptions about how the world works and who belongs where in it. There were those who remained skeptical, not in the organized way of Edrath and his allies, who had been comprehensively and irrevocably removed from the political landscape, but in the quieter way of people who are not hostile, but cannot quite update the map in their heads to include a new territory. Georgina moved through this the way she moved through most things, with patience, without apology, and with the simple ongoing project of herself. She continued her work with the Ferals, which evolved now into something more structured, an understanding between them and the castle that had genuine reciprocity. The wolves ran in the forest and returned to the den when they chose, which increasingly they did, because the den was safe, and the woman in the white dress was there, and she knew all their names. She had named them all eventually. The large scarred male was Thorn. The dark dominant female was River. The one with the hitching walk, whose abscess had healed cleanly, was Wren. The names were hers, given privately at first, and then spoken aloud in front of the king, who had received each one with an expression that she had learned to read as the specific warmth of a man who finds himself continuously delighted by the person he loves in ways he did not anticipate and continues not to anticipate. She had begun, carefully and without announcement, to extend herself beyond the den. She asked questions in the kitchens about where food came from, which led to conversations about the villages in the mountain passes and the conditions there. She walked with Carius on his morning rounds and asked questions about the castle's organization that were not a servant's questions. Not where do I go and what do I do, but why is this done this way and what would happen if it were different? He answered all of them. And sometimes the answers produced changes, because she had a way of identifying inefficiencies and cruelties that had calcified into habit, and pointing at them with such plain accuracy that their continuation became immediately inexplicable. The young kitchen girl who had looked away when Georgina received her punishment came to her one afternoon, with something she wanted to ask but could not find the words for. Georgina waited while she searched, and when she finally arrived at it, she wanted to learn to read. She had always wanted to learn, but it was not something servants did. It was not available to her. Georgina said simply, "It's available now." She began to teach her. Then 3 more. Carius watched all of this with the specific attention of a man who is being continuously confirmed in a decision he was already certain about, which has the particular quality of being both unnecessary and deeply gratifying. He watched her in formal settings, where she had learned quickly the protocols and vocabulary, and did not perform them but inhabited them, wearing the required forms with the ease of someone who understands that forms serve functions and uses them accordingly. He watched her with people she liked. The directness that came out then, the humor, the sharp observations delivered with such a light touch that people laughed before they realized they were also being seen. He watched her with people she didn't like, which was rarer but instructive. She was not cruel, never cruel, but she had a precision in those interactions that was its own kind of force. He watched her in the den, always. That was where he had first seen her, and it was still, in some essential way, where she was most herself. And the privilege of having access to someone's most essential self was not something he intended to let himself take for granted. On the night before their formal wedding ceremony, a ceremony that had been planned by the castle's ceremonial staff with the slightly overwhelmed energy of people who had not been given much time and had a lot of opinions, Carius came to the den alone. He had not arranged to meet her there. He had simply felt the pull of it, the place that had started everything, and followed it. She was there. She was sitting with Thorn, who had fallen into the habit of laying his massive head in her lap, and she was talking to him in that low voice, the particular way she talked to the wolves when she thought no one was listening, which was different from the way she talked to the wolves when she knew he was there, softer and more private, the voice she used for things she was still working out. She looked up and saw him, and the low voice shifted into a smile. He sat beside her on the rock, and Thorn opened one amber eye, assessed, and closed it again. The cave was warm. Genuinely warm now, after Georgina had organized the addition of a proper heating system, arguing successfully to the castle's facilities manager that the ferals' health was directly impacted by the cold, and the castle's responsibility for their welfare included basic thermal conditions. The argument had been irrefutable, and the improvement had been significant. The ferals had responded to the warmth in ways that were physically observable: coats healthier, movement easier, the constant background tension of creatures too cold for too long finally beginning to ease. "Are you nervous?" she asked, looking at him. "No," he said. Then honestly, slightly. "About tomorrow." "About tomorrow," he agreed. "I have been thinking about what I want to say." "In the ceremony?" "Beyond the ceremony. After. When it is just us." He looked at her. "There are things I want you to know. About how I see you. About what you've done for me, and for this place, and for those animals, and I—" He stopped, started again. "I am better at commanding armies than I am at this." She turned to look at him fully, her silver eyes holding his. "You don't have to find the words tonight," she said. "I know. But I'll tell you something." She held his gaze. "What you said in the cave that first day, that they respect me because I am yours. I've thought about it many times since. I know the way it sounded. I know the way it sounded too," she said. "But I've been thinking about what it actually means. Not the possessive, the belonging." A pause. "There is something in me that has always been untethered, like a thing that moves and never fully arrives. And when you said that, something in me thought, oh, here, this is here." She looked at him quietly. "That is what belonging feels like, I think. Not being owned, not being claimed as property, just being seen, being known, being the person that someone means when they say mine." Her voice was steady but very quiet. "You mean me when you say that. Not the idea of me. Not what I could be useful for. Me." He looked at her for a long time. Then he pulled her close with that same irreducible gentleness, his arms around her like something finally put down after a very long carrying, and she felt the long exhale of him and matched it with her own, and they sat together in the warm den with the wolves sleeping around them while the last hours of their separate lives moved quietly toward morning. Outside, the mountains stood permanent and white against the dark. The stars above them were the same stars that had stood above this place for longer than the kingdom had existed, longer than any particular human story, patient and brilliant, and entirely indifferent to the small, warm dramas of the creatures who lived below them. And yet, Georgina would think this later. remembering the way the cave smelled and the way Thorn breathed in his sleep and the way Carius's heartbeat was steady beneath her ear. The indifference of stars is not the same as absence. They are there, burning, every night. And sometimes that is enough to navigate by. The morning of the ceremony was pale gold, winter light at an angle that made the snow on the mountains glow like something lit from inside. The great hall had been dressed with branches of pine and white flowers from the greenhouse, the particular flowers that survived cold by generating their own internal heat, a fact Georgina had mentioned once in passing, and which the ceremonial staff had retained and used with what she recognized as a quietly personal gift. She stood in the antechamber in her white dress and her white hair and the silver circlet that would become today something more formal and permanent, and she felt calm. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing something else, but the real thing. The calm that comes from having arrived at a place you were moving toward for a long time, without knowing the destination. A knock at the door. The young kitchen girl she had been teaching to read. Mira, who had arrived 3 months ago at lessons with 2 more friends, and who had recently completed her first full book, and had the expression of someone for whom an entire universe has newly opened, leaned in. "He's ready," Mira said, with a smile that contained nothing but genuine joy. "They all are," Georgina smiled back. "So am I." The ceremony was traditional in form, because some forms are kept not from complacency, but from understanding that certain structures exist because they hold things that need holding. The weight of witness, the gravity of public commitment, the making real of private things through the act of saying them aloud before everyone who will be affected. Carius spoke his vows with the deliberateness he brought to all consequential speech, each word given its full weight, and she listened to them feeling the particular clarity of a moment that has been arrived at through sufficient difficulty to be truly, fully appreciated. When she spoke her own vows, her voice was steady. She had written them herself, late at night in the den with Thorn's head in her lap, and they said the things that needed to be said, that she had not come here looking for this, that what she had found had exceeded every expectation of herself, that she intended to be worthy of it for the rest of her life, that the kingdom he ruled was a place she loved, not simply because he was in it, but because it had mountains and ferals and kitchen girls who wanted to read, and workers in the high passes who needed what a queen with her particular attention could provide, that she would not disappear into the role. She would bring herself to it. There was a sound in the hall when she finished, not the sound of a formal court performing approval, but the sound of people who have been moved and are briefly showing it, before the necessary composure returns. Carius looked at her with those dark eyes, and in them was everything she had come to know was there. The fierceness that faced the world, and the tenderness that was hers alone. The man behind the king. The grief that had become, through some alchemy she had been part of, something else. Not forgetting. Not replacement. Something more like the tree that grows through the rock. Shaped by the obstacle, made stronger by the shaping, finding its way toward light. He took her hand. She gave it. The gathered court witnessed the Alpha King and his new queen, standing at the center of the great hall in the pale gold light, and they saw, those who were paying the right kind of attention, not a king and a servant, not a transaction of position or bloodline or political necessity. They saw 2 people who had found each other in an unlikely place and built something real in it, something that had already been tested and had held and intended to keep holding. In the cave at the north wall, on the morning of the wedding, Thorn had done an unusual thing. He had pressed his nose briefly to the white dress that Georgina had left hanging there the previous night. Left there deliberately, a way of telling the wolves where she was going, and that she would return. He had held his face against the fabric for a moment, and then he had made that low sound, not a growl but its opposite, the sound he made when the door opened and she came in, and the other wolves had stirred from sleep and made it too, a brief chorus of recognition and acknowledgement, and something that might, if you were inclined toward generosity, be called gladness. The small injured female, Wren, who walked now without the hitch, whose abscess had healed completely, who had become in the months since her recovery the most affectionate of the pack, the one most likely to be found leaning against Georgina's leg while she worked, lifted her face and made her own sound, higher and longer, and then settled back down. The cave held its warmth. The ferals slept. Outside, the mountains stood. And in the great hall of the castle, in the kingdom of ice and mountains, a woman who had arrived with a bucket and a rag and the particular quiet courage of someone who had never been told their courage was worth anything, took her place in a story that had always been building toward her, even when neither she nor anyone else could see it. The wolves had known before anyone. Wolves, it turns out, understand these things. They understand the difference between someone who comes into your dark and frightened place and tries to command you, and someone who comes in and simply kneels, who does not ask you to be other than what you are, but sees what you are and stays anyway, who speaks to your particular fear in the frequency that reaches it, not because they were trained to, but because they are, at their core, fluent in the language of genuine care. They understand, because they have always understood, the weight of presence, the quality of a person who does not fill a space by being loud, but by being real. And when they find that person, they do not let them go. Neither, in the end, did the Alpha King. He had stood in the cave entrance on a cold morning and watched a woman in a red dress kneel before creatures everyone else had given up on. And something in him had known. The deep animal knowing that precedes all articulation. That this was the thing he had been waiting for. Not a comfort. Not a distraction. The real thing. The irreplaceable specific thing. He had said she was his before he understood that he meant it as gift, not possession. Before he understood that what he was really saying was, I see you. I am claiming you not from the world, but for it. Into visibility. Into permanence. And she had heard it, beneath the words. Had heard the real sentence, the one beneath, and had recognized it the way you recognize something you've never seen before, but somehow know. The shape of a home you were always moving toward, arriving finally at its door. She had walked through. They both had. And the den that had been a place of fear became, over time, the place the castle pointed to when it wanted to explain what had changed. Not the ceremonies or the proclamations or the political restructurings, though all of those came too. The den, the cave, the place where a woman with a bucket had knelt before something wounded and waited, with infinite patience, for trust to become possible. The place where a king had learned to be simply a man. The place where the ferals, who had forgotten that the world could be anything other than hostile, remembered otherwise, long after, when the story was told, and it was told many times, in kitchens and guard rooms and the high-pass villages, and eventually in the histories that careful people write down when they recognize they are living through something worth remembering. What people always came back to was the beginning of it, the girl with the bucket, the cave, the moment when 6 enormous wolves lay down around a woman in a red dress while she scrubbed the floor, and the world shifted quietly on its axis, and nothing was entirely the same afterward. And the voice of the Alpha King, filling the dark cave, deep and certain and slightly bewildered, as if discovering something that had always been true. She controls them because she is mine. He had it backwards, of course. Or not quite backwards. More like partial. The incomplete first sight of a thing before the full picture resolves. Because she controlled nothing. That was always the point. She offered, and they came. She stayed, and they trusted. She saw them as they were, and they became something better than they had been. And so did he. That is the whole of it, really. That is what love is, at its truest. Not the taking of territory, but the offering of witness. Not the claiming of something for yourself, but the becoming of something for someone else. The willingness to enter the dark places without a weapon. The faith that what seems like a monster is often only a wound wearing its protection. Georgina Moonfire had known this all her life. She had carried it like a lamp through all the dark rooms she had walked through before she found the door that was meant for her. And when she opened it, the king on the other side of it had dark eyes and black hair, and a gentleness that the world had never been permitted to see. And he had been standing there longer than either of them knew, waiting for someone who would not flinch at his particular darkness. He had been waiting for someone who would kneel. She knelt, and he came toward her. And all the things they had each thought were finished turned out to be beginnings. The mountains held. The stars burned. The wolves slept in their warm den, guarding, as wolves will, the place where something precious began. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.